What if I told you that most people lose the game of life before they even know they're playing? Every morning, you wake up believing you're reacting to reality. Your boss, your bank account, your relationships, your health, the economy, bad luck, good luck. You tell yourself these things are creating your life. But according to a woman writing almost 100 years ago, you've got the direction backwards. Reality isn't writing your story. You're writing reality. That sounds outrageous, maybe even dangerous. And yet, this tiny book has quietly influenced generations of entrepreneurs, artists, motivational speakers, spiritual teachers, and psychologists, long before manifestation became a social media buzzword. Before The Secret, before mindset coaches, Florence Scovel Shinn proposed something radical. She claimed life operates by invisible laws, as precise as gravity. Ignore them, and life feels like an endless struggle. Understand them, and the same world begins opening doors you never knew existed. Published in 1925, The Game of Life and How to Play It isn't really about positive thinking. It's about mental architecture, the hidden operating system beneath every success, every failure, every opportunity, and every setback. Shinn believed your thoughts, your words, your emotional habits were not private experiences. They were instructions. Instructions constantly being sent into what she called the subconscious mind. And according to her, the subconscious never argues. It simply builds. As she repeatedly illustrates throughout the book, the inner picture comes before the outer experience, whether that picture is one of abundance, fear, confidence, or limitation. Imagine trying to build a house. You don't start with bricks. You start with a blueprint. Now imagine trying to build your future. Without ever looking at the blueprint, your mind has been drawing every single day. That's the game. And most people are unknowingly handing the pencil to fear. The anti-mediocrity challenge. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't rise to the level of your ambitions. You sink to the level of your dominant beliefs. You can read 50 books, watch 1,000 motivational videos, listen to every productivity podcast on earth. But if your subconscious expects failure, your conscious goals become little more than wishful thinking. That's why two people with identical talent, identical education, and identical opportunities can end up living completely different lives. One sees possibility, the other sees obstacles. Same world, different blueprint. Florence Scovel Shinn would say, they're playing different games now. Before you dismiss all this as mystical thinking, consider something fascinating. Modern neuroscience has discovered something called the reticular activating system. It's a network inside your brain that filters millions of pieces of information every second. If you decide to buy a red car, you suddenly see red cars everywhere. The cars weren't created overnight. Your attention changed. Your brain started searching for evidence matching your expectation. Psychologists call this selective attention. Shinn simply described it differently. She believed your dominant expectations organize your experience. Different language. Surprisingly similar observation. Florence Scovel Shinn's big promise. Shinn wasn't promising magic. She wasn't saying you could sit on your couch, repeat affirmations, and money would fall from the ceiling. That's the version the internet created decades later. Her actual message was much deeper. She believed thoughts, words, expectation, emotion, and decisive action must all point in the same direction. Only then does life begin cooperating. Throughout the book, she repeatedly emphasizes acting in harmony with faith, remaining receptive to intuitive guidance, and expecting the desired outcome rather than merely wishing for it. The sacred ritual. Every powerful philosophy has a ritual. Stoics journal. Monks meditate. Athletes visualize. Shinn had something different. She insisted your first words each morning matter more than most people realize. She recommended beginning the day with deliberate affirmations, statements that align the mind toward completion, gratitude, and expectancy before fear has a chance to take control. Not because words are magical, but because repeated language slowly becomes identity. And identity becomes behavior. Behavior becomes destiny. Imagine beginning every day, not checking notifications, not opening emails, not scrolling endless bad news, but deliberately deciding who you're going to become before the world tells you who you are. That's not motivation. That's programming. The big question, but here's the question that changes everything. If life really is a game, what are the rules? Why do some people seem to attract opportunity, while others repeatedly attract the same disappointments? Why do some relationships heal, while others repeat the same arguments, year after year? Why does fear often create exactly what it wants to avoid? And most importantly, if your inner world really shapes your outer world, how do you rewrite the code? Because that's exactly where Florence Scovel Shinn takes us next. She reveals 3 invisible laws that govern the game. Laws that most people unknowingly violate every single day. And once you see them, you'll never look at your own thoughts or your own words the same way again. Florence Scovel Shinn believed that life is not random chaos. It's a system. And like any system, it has rules. Miss the rules, and you keep getting the same painful results. Learn the rules, and suddenly events that once looked like luck begin to make sense. She reduces the entire game to 3 invisible laws. The law of mental pictures, the law of the spoken word, and the law of non-resistance. Think of them as vision, vibration, and flow. Master these 3, and you stop playing defense against life. You start becoming the architect of your experience. Shinn's first claim is the foundation of everything else. She writes that the imagination is constantly cutting pictures that eventually appear in a person's outer life. What is repeatedly imagined and emotionally impressed upon the subconscious tends to express itself in experience. In modern language, your brain is a prediction machine. It is always building an internal model of reality. And here's the dangerous part. It does not clearly distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a repeatedly rehearsed fear. The fear that became a future Shinn tells the story of a man who became obsessed with a rare disease. He read about it constantly, imagined it repeatedly, feared it daily. Eventually, he developed the very condition he had been rehearsing in his mind. She presents this as an example of how a distorted imagination can impress the subconscious and influence the body. Now, whether you accept her conclusion literally or symbolically, the psychological pattern is undeniable. People who constantly rehearse catastrophe often begin behaving as if catastrophe is already on its way. They avoid opportunities, misread neutral events as threats, become hypervigilant, and over time, they help create the very outcomes they fear. A modern example. The interview picture two candidates walking into the same job interview. Candidate A has spent the entire week thinking, I'm probably not qualified. They're going to expose me. I always mess these things up. By the time the interview starts, their body is already acting out the prediction. Shallow breathing, weak eye contact, defensive answers. Candidate B has spent the week visualizing a productive conversation. Not perfection, just competence, curiosity, contribution. They walk in with a completely different nervous system. Same interview, different blueprint. And here's the key insight. The visualization did not magically force the company to hire them. It changed the behavior that influenced the outcome. That's a very different claim, and a much more useful one. The 1% formula Shinn argues that whatever is impressed upon the subconscious is carried out in detail. Modern behavioral science would frame this as repeated mental rehearsal shaping attention, emotion, and action patterns. The effect is usually gradual, rather than instantaneous. Not instant manifestation. Not cosmic vending machines. Think of it like compound interest. A tiny shift in self-image changes tiny daily decisions. Those decisions accumulate. If you improve your thinking, confidence, and behavior by just 1% each day, the long-term effect becomes enormous. The picture you hold most often becomes the direction you move most naturally. That's the first law. Law 2, your words are instructions. This is the chapter that made Shinn famous. She believed words are not harmless sounds. They are commands. She repeatedly quotes the biblical idea that life and death are in the power of the tongue, and argues that people make laws for themselves through habitual speech. What a person continually declares, they begin to expect, notice, and move toward. The man who always missed the train, one man constantly said, I always miss the car. His daughter said, I always catch the car. According to Shinn, each had created a separate law for themselves through repeated expectation and declaration. Their attention and behavior aligned with the story they kept telling. This sounds almost superstitious until you notice how often people do this today. I'm terrible with money. I can never stick to a routine. Relationships never work out for me. I'm just an anxious person. At first, these are descriptions. After enough repetition, they become identities. And identities are incredibly difficult to outperform. The brain is listening. Neuroscientists have found that self-talk affects performance, stress response, and decision-making. When athletes use constructive internal language, they often perform better under pressure. When people engage in constant negative self-talk, cortisol rises, confidence drops, and persistence decreases. Shinn's language was spiritual. The mechanism is psychological. But the practical lesson is the same. Stop issuing defeat orders to your own mind. The new-fashioned conversation, one of my favorite moments in the entire book, is when Shinn describes refusing what she calls an old-fashioned chat. She says those conversations revolve around loss, illness, failure, and limitation, and that they are expensive because they reinforce the very conditions people claim they don't want. Instead, she suggests talking about what we want to create rather than endlessly rehearsing what we fear. Think about that. How many hours each week are spent rehearsing problems with friends? Not solving them. Rehearsing them. The brain treats repetition as importance. So if you spend 10 hours a week talking about what is broken, your attention becomes trained to search for more evidence that things are broken. Shinn isn't saying ignore reality. She's saying don't worship the problem. The most effective affirmation near the end of this section, she offers a simple rhythmic affirmation. I have a wonderful work. In a wonderful way, I give wonderful service for wonderful pay. Why does this work better than vague positive thinking? Because it is specific. It includes the activity, the quality, the contribution, and the reward. In modern terms, it's a compact identity statement. Not I want success, but I am a person who creates value and is well compensated for it. That is a much stronger instruction. Now we reach the most counterintuitive idea in the entire book. Shinn says what you resist persists. She points to water as the model. Water is soft, but it can wear down stone because it does not waste energy fighting every obstacle. She uses this as an illustration of non-resistance rather than passivity. The phone call that never came. Shinn tells a story about anxiously waiting for an important phone call. She resisted every interruption, refused to make outgoing calls, became tense and fearful. After an hour, she discovered the receiver had been off the hook the entire time. The phone had been disconnected. She interprets this as an example of resistance creating interference, and says that once she relaxed, blessed the situation, and released the fear, communication resumed smoothly. Whether or not you accept the metaphysical interpretation, the psychological lesson is brilliant. When people become desperate, they often start overmanaging. They grip too tightly, micromanage, panic, force. And that state reduces creativity and problem-solving ability. The river strategy, imagine you're trying to sleep. The more you think, I must fall asleep right now, the more awake you become. Sleep comes when resistance drops. The same thing happens in negotiations, relationships, and creative work. Sometimes the breakthrough arrives after you stop forcing it. This is not quitting. It is releasing the emotional friction that is blocking clear action. The relationship mirror. Shinn gives a powerful example of a woman who escaped a controlling mother by getting married, only to discover she had married a man with the same controlling traits. She uses this story to argue that unresolved inner patterns tend to recreate themselves until they are understood and changed. Modern psychology has a name for this: repetition compulsion. We unconsciously recreate familiar emotional dynamics, even painful ones, because the nervous system prefers the familiar over the unknown. So when Shinn says, life is a mirror, she is pointing to a profound truth. Where you are emotionally reactive, you are often still unfinished. The first synthesis: let's put the system together. Mental pictures create the blueprint of what you expect and prepare for. Spoken words reinforce the identity and expectations that guide behavior. Non-resistance removes the fear and tension that interfere with intelligent action. This is the operating system of the game. And if you stopped right here and applied only these 3 ideas, your life would already begin changing. You would catch yourself rehearsing failure. You would stop speaking limitation as if it were a permanent fact. You would notice where fear is making you force outcomes instead of responding intelligently. But Shinn isn't finished. Because hidden underneath these 3 laws is a deeper principle that most readers completely miss. A principle that sounds mystical on the surface, yet has surprising parallels with modern ideas about intuition, opportunity, and the brain's ability to detect patterns before conscious reasoning catches up. She calls it guidance. And understanding it may be the difference between working hard in the wrong direction and moving with a current that seems to carry you forward. The hidden secret: most readers miss the contrarian wisdom and the deep dive music, deep ambient strings, slow heartbeat, the feeling of entering unknown territory. Visual, A lone traveler stands at a crossroads at dawn. One path is crowded. The other disappears into mist. Narrator: most people think the game of life and how to play it is a book about positive thinking. It isn't. That's the biggest misunderstanding surrounding Florence Scovel Shinn. If positive thinking alone changed lives, everyone who pasted motivational quotes on their bathroom mirror would be living their dream life. But they aren't, because Shinn wasn't teaching optimism. She was teaching alignment. And those are very different things. The myth that keeps people stuck today's self-help culture often says, just think positively. Smile more. Visualize success. Ignore negative emotions. Manifest abundance. But here's the problem. You can't lie to your subconscious. You can repeat, "I'm rich," 1,000 times. But if every cell in your body is screaming, "I'm terrified I'll lose everything," guess which message wins? The subconscious responds less to the words you repeat, and more to the emotions you consistently rehearse. Shinn understood this almost a century before neuroscience began studying emotional conditioning. She insisted that affirmations should feel believable enough to impress the subconscious, rather than being empty phrases repeated without conviction. The real secret is congruence. Imagine trying to row a boat. One oar pulls forward. The other pulls backward. You'll exhaust yourself without moving. That's how most people live. They say, "I want success," but secretly believe, "People like me never succeed." They say, "I want love," but expect rejection. They say, "I want abundance," but spend every day rehearsing scarcity. The conscious mind makes requests. The subconscious follows expectations. Shinn's message is simple. When those two finally agree, movement becomes effortless. The hidden law of intuition. Now we arrive at one of the most fascinating ideas in the book. Shinn believed every person receives what she called divine leads. Not dramatic voices from the sky. Not mystical visions. Small nudges. Unexpected ideas. Chance encounters. An impulse to make a phone call. A feeling to take a different route. A sudden certainty. She repeatedly advises readers to remain spiritually alert, expecting guidance and acting on opportunities rather than allowing fear to override intuition. Today, psychologists call something similar recognition. Your brain constantly processes information beneath conscious awareness, long before your logical mind catches up. Your subconscious notices patterns. Experienced firefighters know when a building is about to collapse, without knowing exactly why. Chess grandmasters recognize winning moves within seconds. Elite investors often sense something is wrong before they can fully explain it. Years of accumulated experience become intuition. Shinn interpreted this through a spiritual lens. Modern psychology explains it through pattern recognition. Different language. Remarkably similar phenomenon. Picture this. Imagine you suddenly think about someone you haven't spoken to in years. Most people ignore it. They assume it's random. But what if you called? That conversation introduces you to someone who changes your career. Not because destiny magically rearranged the universe, but because you acted on information your conscious mind hadn't fully processed. Sometimes opportunity whispers. It almost never shouts. The ritual of releasing the burden. Now, we come to perhaps the most famous practice in the entire book. Shinn calls it casting the burden. At first glance, it sounds deeply religious, but underneath, it lies an extraordinary psychological strategy. When overwhelmed by fear, resentment, lack, or confusion, she recommends consciously handing the burden over to the higher mind, what she calls the Christ within, instead of continuing to mentally wrestle with it. She describes repeatedly affirming, "I cast this burden on the Christ within, and I go free," until clarity replaces anxiety. Look beyond the religious language. Here's what she's actually describing. Stop trying to solve tomorrow's problems with today's panic. A modern parallel: think about your own life. Have you ever obsessed over a problem for hours, getting nowhere, only to wake up the next morning and suddenly know exactly what to do? That isn't magic. When stress decreases, the brain reconnects areas responsible for creativity, insight, and long-term thinking. Your best ideas rarely arrive during panic. They arrive after release. That's the genius behind casting the burden. It interrupts the cycle of fear. The story of the piano, one of the book's most memorable examples, involves a student who received a new piano. There was only one problem. The old piano still occupied the room. She had nowhere to put it. She worried. She stressed. Nothing happened. Finally, she stopped struggling, repeated the practice of releasing the burden. Moments later, the phone rang. Someone wanted to rent the old piano. It left just before the new one arrived. Whether you view that as coincidence, divine timing, or simply the result of becoming mentally open enough to notice solutions, the lesson remains powerful. Fear narrows perception. Peace expands it. Wait, what? Here's the truly contrarian part. Shinn never says, "Control everything." She says almost the opposite: prepare, believe, act, then release. That's the paradox. You control your inner state, not every external event. And ironically, the less desperately you cling to specific outcomes, the more adaptable and often more successful you become. The case study: James Stockdale. Let's leave 1925 for a moment. In 1965, American naval officer James Stockdale was shot down over Vietnam. He spent more than 7 years as a prisoner of war. He was tortured repeatedly, yet he survived. Years later, author Jim Collins asked him how. Stockdale gave an unforgettable answer. He said the people who didn't make it were often the optimists. Not because optimism is bad, but because they kept telling themselves, "We'll be out by Christmas." Christmas came. Nothing changed. Then Easter. Then summer. Eventually, hope tied to specific outcomes collapsed. Stockdale survived because he balanced two ideas. He never lost faith, but he never denied reality. That's remarkably close to Shinn's philosophy: faith without fantasy, acceptance without surrender, action without panic. That combination creates resilience. The secret sauce. So what's the real operating system hidden inside this book? It's not positive thinking. It's not magical manifestation. It's this: your inner condition determines the quality of your outer decisions. And your outer decisions shape your life. Shinn wraps this truth in spiritual language. Modern psychology wraps it in neuroscience. But both point toward the same destination. The calm mind sees opportunities. The fearful mind sees threats. The grateful mind notices abundance. The resentful mind notices injustice. Reality hasn't changed. Your lens has. And your lens changes everything. Now the pieces are beginning to fit. Mental pictures, spoken words, non-resistance, intuition, release. Each one seems separate, but together they form a single system, a way of moving through uncertainty with clarity instead of fear. In our final chapter, we'll bring all of these ideas together. We'll test them against modern life, business, relationships, sports, mental health, and personal growth. And we'll answer the final question. What does it actually look like to play the game of life well? Playing the game in the modern world, the synthesis and modern application so far. We've explored Florence Scovel Shinn's invisible laws. We've learned that your imagination becomes your blueprint. Your words become instructions. Resistance creates friction, and releasing fear creates space for clarity. But one question remains. How do you actually live this way? Because philosophy means nothing unless it changes Tuesday morning, unless it changes the next difficult conversation, the next business decision, the next setback, the next ordinary day. This is where Shinn's ideas become surprisingly practical. The game isn't won in big moments. People imagine life changes because of one giant breakthrough, one promotion, one investment, one perfect relationship, one lucky break. But that's rarely how transformation happens. Life is usually decided in ordinary moments. The conversation you almost avoided, the opportunity you nearly ignored, the words you spoke to yourself after failing, the emotion you rehearsed before going to sleep, the habits nobody applauds. Those are the moves that determine the game. Shinn understood something psychologists now emphasize. You don't become what you occasionally do. You become what you repeatedly reinforce. Rapid-fire montage business. One founder spends every meeting thinking, please don't reject me. Another walks in asking, how can I solve their problem? Same presentation, different psychology. One is trying not to lose. The other is trying to create value. Guess which energy is more persuasive? Confidence isn't arrogance. It's freedom from constant self-protection. Sports elite athletes don't spend years visualizing failure. They mentally rehearse execution. They don't imagine the medal. They imagine the race. Every stride, every breath, every movement. Visualization isn't fantasy. It's preparation. Shinn would smile at that, because that's exactly how she described mental pictures. Not wishing, preparing. Relationships. Imagine two people in conflict. One enters the conversation armed with every past mistake, every old resentment, every scar. The other asks, what outcome do I actually want? Immediately, the conversation changes. One is defending the past. The other is building the future. Shinn repeatedly reminds readers that life mirrors the condition within us, and that lasting change begins by changing ourselves rather than demanding others change first. Mental health. Let's be clear. This book should never be used to blame people for illness, trauma, or circumstances beyond their control. Life is more complex than that. Modern psychology recognizes genetics, environment, trauma, biology, and social conditions as profoundly important. What Shinn offers isn't blame. It's agency. She's asking a different question. Given whatever life has handed you, what are you feeding your mind today? That question still matters. Because while we can't control every event, we can influence how we interpret it. And interpretation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. The three mirrors: imagine your life as three mirrors. The first asks, what are you repeatedly imagining? The second asks, what story are you constantly telling yourself? The third asks, what action naturally follows those beliefs? Change one mirror, and the others begin changing too. That's why Shinn insisted transformation always begins inside. Not because reality doesn't matter, but because perception is the doorway through which you meet reality. Here's something remarkable. Whether you're reading Marcus Aurelius, Viktor Frankl, James Clear, Carol Dweck, or Florence Scovel Shinn, they're all pointing toward the same mountain from different directions. The Stoics say, control your response. Frankl says, choose your attitude. Modern psychology says, your beliefs shape your behavior. Shinn says, guard your imagination and your words. Different vocabulary, same destination. Inner mastery. The integrated system, if we had to reduce the entire book to one practical system, it would look like this. Step 1. Choose the picture. Before reacting to life, decide what you're building. Ask yourself, what future deserves today's attention? Step 2. Speak like the future is under construction. Not with denial, not with fantasy, but with deliberate language. Replace "nothing ever works" with "I'm learning how to make this work." Small difference, massive consequence. Step 3. Take the next intelligent action. Not the perfect action. The next one. Faith without movement becomes wishful thinking. Movement without direction becomes exhaustion. The combination changes everything. Step 4. Release what you cannot control. Do the work, then let go. The mind performs best when it isn't strangled by fear. The modern morning ritual: imagine beginning tomorrow differently. Before your phone, before the news, before emails, before the opinions of strangers. Just 5 quiet minutes. Ask yourself 3 questions. What am I creating today? What words will define today? What burden can I stop carrying? That's it. 5 minutes. A new blueprint. Day after day. Year after year. Small rituals become identities. Identities become destinies. The ultimate reward: what happens when you truly live this way? Problems don't disappear. Life doesn't become perfect. People still disappoint you. Plans still fail. Storms still arrive. But something profound changes. You stop feeling like life is happening to you, and begin acting as though life is unfolding through you. Fear loses its monopoly. Opportunity becomes easier to notice. Failure becomes information instead of identity. Your attention shifts from scarcity to possibility, from reaction to intention, from survival to creation. That, more than money, more than success, more than achievement, is the real victory. Because you've learned to play the game instead of letting the game play you. Nearly 100 years after Florence Scovel Shinn wrote The Game of Life and How to Play It, the world has changed beyond recognition. We have smartphones, artificial intelligence, social media, space travel, instant communication. Yet the battlefield she described still exists. It has simply moved today. The greatest competition isn't for money, or status, or followers. It's for your attention, your imagination, your inner dialogue. Because whoever shapes those eventually shapes your life. The final lesson, if this entire documentary could be reduced to one sentence, it would be this: your life moves in the direction of the thoughts you repeatedly believe, the words you consistently speak, and the actions you courageously repeat. Not overnight, not magically, but relentlessly. Every day, you are writing instructions. The only question is, who's holding the pen? Your challenge for the next 7 days. Conduct one simple experiment. Notice every time you say, I can't, I always, I never, that's just who I am. Pause. Ask yourself, is this a fact? Or is it a story I've rehearsed so many times that it feels like one? Then rewrite it. Not into fantasy, into possibility. Because every new life begins as a new sentence. Picture an old chess master sitting quietly across the board. He watches you make your move. He doesn't criticize. He doesn't rush you. He simply smiles because he knows something you don't. The board has never been your enemy. The pieces have never been against you. The game was never rigged. You simply hadn't learned the rules. Now, perhaps you have. The next move is yours.